I'm wondering, you were a journalist at the MIT Technology Review, which is not particularly known for very investigative reporting.
That's true. Yeah, I think it kind of goes back to even earlier in the story. I studied engineering at MIT for undergrad, and I actually went and worked in the tech industry before I became a journalist. And part of the reason why I then became a journalist was because in the brief time that I was in Silicon Valley, I very quickly started to realize that a lot of the incentives around innovation within the Valley were facilitating technologies that are profitable, but not necessarily aligned in the public interest. And so when I went into journalism, I started focusing on technology reporting and then AI reporting, getting a job at MIT Tech Review to cover that AI research. And there had always been in the back of my mind these questions lingering on how do we get to a place where we do start having aligned incentives to develop technology in the public interest. And AI was such a perfect technology for digging into those questions because AI intersects everything and it is already a profoundly consequential technology shaping our society. And so when I first became interested in OpenAI, it was initially just because they conceived of themselves as a fundamental AI research lab, and I was covering fundamental AI research. And so I wanted to just learn a little bit more about the work that they were doing and the technical advancements that they were making. But quickly, as I started interviewing executives and employees, the thing that became much more interesting to me was not the research, but the fact that this organization was very bespokely designed to be a nonprofit with a for-profit in it and was trying to position itself as really transparent and collaborative and focused on a mission to benefit all of humanity. And I was discovering that there was a disjointedness with how they portrayed themselves and how they actually operated. And so that it wasn't my intention to investigate anything. I was just curious and asking questions. And then I kind of fell into realizing that this was the story that I had to write, that this disconnect between what they were espousing and what they were doing and how that could ultimately have ripple effects on both the way that AI was introduced into society and also the way that people would ultimately understand this technology.
Unlike many journalists who are more like generalists, you have actual degree from MIT. And how did it help you in the whole process of understanding this industry?
So most people think that it helped me because I am able to understand the technical details better. I don't think it helped me in that way. I don't believe that you need to have a technical degree to understand technical details because every industry has very specific details and mechanisms and vocabulary and things that you have to learn. And for whatever reason, people are perfectly comfortable, learning all about finance and the intricacies of finance, or all about politics and the intricacies of politics. But then when it comes to technology, they think it's a different category of specialized knowledge. And I don't believe in that. But I think what did help me is Silicon Valley is a very elitist space. And being an MIT graduate gave me access to people faster and allowed me to interview them with more depth because they were willing to spend more time with me to talk about the technical aspects. So it helped me in that way, in that it opened doors quickly, but it didn't, I don't think substantively in terms of my ability to understand the information, it actually helped me that much at all.
At some point, you were covering, like you said, tech aspects of AI. And can you just bring me back to the day when you realized, okay, there's something wrong here? What was the point?
At OpenAI, it started happening quite quickly. So I embedded within the company for 3 days in August of 2019. And the first meeting that I had was with Ilya Sutskever, who was the chief scientist at the time, and Greg Brockman, the chief technology officer. And I started with very basic questions. I just wanted to understand OpenAI had this mission to ensure artificial general intelligence benefits all of humanity. And so I was asking them, what does that mean? And why are you focused on this problem? There's so many different problems in the world that at that point, OpenAI had already gotten a $1 billion investment. I was like, there's so many different problems that you could use $1 billion for. So why do you focus on this? What is AGI? What does it mean to benefit all of humanity? And I quickly realized they couldn't actually articulate these basic questions. And that made me start getting a little bit skeptical because they positioned themselves as an anti-Silicon Valley lab. They were trying to counter the way that Silicon Valley had over-indexed on profit previously. But it seemed to me that this was very culturally of Silicon Valley, that you end up with tons of money, tons of financial runway to try and pursue an idea that you don't actually really have that much of a hold on. And then I started asking people, other teams, how do you operationalize this goal that you have? And I realized that no matter who I talked to, they had slightly different understandings of what they were ultimately doing. There wasn't actually a very cohesive vision. And some of the executives told me that this was a feature, not a bug, because no one really knew what artificial general intelligence was. And therefore, it was perfectly fine that they all had different definitions of what they were trying to do. And I noticed that whereas they portray themselves as highly transparent, they were actually really secretive. They wouldn't share a lot of information with me, even though they said that they would share everything that they ultimately did with the public. And when I started doing more interviews after those 3 days that were self-sourced with a couple dozen other people started sharing with me, yeah, this is one of the most secretive organizations that I've ever worked for, which was quite interesting. And the final disconnect was just, they said that they were collaborative, but then executives were really emphasizing to me, in order for us to achieve our mission, which they couldn't really define, we have to be first, which is inherently a competitive strategy. And so when I pushed against, I was like, there's an inherent tension here. Like, you can't be collaborative and competitive at the same time. They were like, no, it's a healthy tension. We balance it. And how do they balance it? They also couldn't really quite say.
So it's more you started to dig in, it's more controversies you started to notice.
Yeah.
I like the part of your book where you describe this sort of cognitive dissonance of a Silicon Valley, the best minds of and founders of companies trying to solve the big problems of the whole entire world while going on back to the office and sort of stepping over homeless people and this whole house that you unfortunately see on the streets of San Francisco. So it kind of, in a way, I like this analogy and how you also explain this paradox of and disconnection with what they trying to solve and the reality that they're not facing or not trying to sort of avoiding of. How did it influence your sort of perception going further while you were doing more investigation on that subject?
This was, when I worked in the Valley, this was always something that really bothered me, that you had to sort of suspend reality in order to exist for a long time in San Francisco, because you would spend all of your day talking about the wonderful, amazing things that were going to happen in the future and all the problems that you were going to solve with whatever technology you were building. And then as you're on your way home or on your way to the office, you see the deep inequality and serious issues in San Francisco that have been there and have been getting worse for years. And, there's this quote that I have from Sam Altman himself talking about this problem, saying he acknowledges that this is an issue, that San Francisco had so much wealth generation in such a concentrated amount of time and space that it probably did some weird things and led to some of the effects that you see, like an increase in homelessness and things like that. But then whereas he's always like, AGI is totally possible. It's the greatest challenge that we've ever faced in humanity and we're totally going to solve it. Then he's like, homelessness is such a hard problem to solve. So it's like, there's just not much that we can do about it. I mean, it's just like that kind of encapsulated a lot of the culture that I did not like about being in the Valley. And I think that culture really trickles into people's worldviews. And if you continue to exist in this space where you constantly have to ignore reality in order to continue focusing on the things that you do, then obviously the technologies you build are also going to be disconnected from the real world.
So apart from the sort of announcement to go towards nonprofit, being open, transparent, and in reality being very secretive and sort of commercial, what other things that shocked you the most while you were doing more research on OpenAI and in general this industry?
One of the things that's quite challenging about the pursuit of artificial intelligence in general is this idea that you can recreate human intelligence. And this goes back all the way to like the history of AI and where it comes from. The term was originally coined in 1956 by a Dartmouth assistant professor, John McCarthy. And he, decades after he coined the term, said publicly, I invented the term artificial intelligence in order to get some money for a summer study. So in the summer of 1956, he was trying to bring together all these scientists to recreate, to create a new discipline or kind of unify all of the research that they were doing. And he realized that previously the name that he had been using, automata studies, was just not getting the attention that was necessary to ultimately entice foundations and the government to give them money. And at the time, his mentor really pushed back on the idea of using the term artificial intelligence because he said, this is going to be really confusing to people. It's like a false label to ultimately say that we're trying to recreate human intelligence, in part because there's to this day, no scientific consensus around what human intelligence is. So how are you supposed to recreate something that you don't really understand? But the term ended up sticking, and now all the way to present day, we do end up with a lot of confusion about what AI is, what it's supposed to do, how it's supposed to be integrated into society, and things like that. And within OpenAI and within the AI world, I think there isn't, whereas there used to be that questioning of, should we actually be calling it AI, and are we actually trying to recreate human intelligence? I think within OpenAI now, there isn't really a questioning of that anymore. Yes, we are absolutely doing this. And many people think, yes, it's absolutely possible. But you run into this issue where, again, because we don't really know what human intelligence is, we use very crude benchmarks to measure AI capabilities. And one of the things that shocked me that I put into the book is all benchmarks are imperfect, and they're sort of inherently coded with a particular view around what makes someone smart or not. And you know, like the fact that they might choose math benchmarks or coding benchmarks is perhaps no surprise because they're coders and mathematicians, and they think that that's what, you know, being really good at those things makes you smart. But then they would have these discussions where I ended up getting some documents from like early in OpenAI's history where they had discussions about ultimately they were debating whether or not to pursue large language models and whether or not large language models would be an effective way to try and recreate human intelligence. And they started making comparisons to deaf and blind people who their analogy was, oh, deaf and blind people only have access to language and they seem generally smart enough. And, you know, then they had a whole debate about like whether deaf and blind people are in fact as smart as people who have sight and have hearing. And that is when you start to hit upon some of the deeply problematic roots of AI and measurements of intelligence, is that you start very quickly to talk about who has superior versus inferior intelligence. And then you start, you know, like the entire history of the measurement of intelligence then rears its head. And it turns out that this history is also very dark and rooted in things like eugenics, where people tried to use this idea of superior versus inferior intelligence to justify getting rid of certain people in society. And so that was another thing that shocked me, but was something that this wasn't something I encountered when I first started reporting on the company. This was something that over time, as I continued reporting on the company and just the field in general and the industry, that I realized was a very dark aspect of this quest bubbling beneath the surface.
So just to understand, the pursuit to recreate human intelligence, it's not about the pursuit itself, but is the approach to this pursuit. Is that what bothers you? Or is, in general, you think this pursuit to recreate the human intelligence is wrong as fundamentally?
I think it's wrong fundamentally for multiple reasons. One is that it's just confusing. We could actually just define, like, why not just talk about it as we're improving computation in the world? I think that is a much cleaner understanding of what's being done and where to apply this technology. You know, back in the day when calculators started doing math, we didn't call it human intelligence and then give people calculators saying this is a digital assistant for you and it's going to be your companion and your coworker and whatever. You know, it's just like, this is a calculator and it does math, you know. And so part of it is that just the association with recreating human intelligence is just, to the public, ends up being very difficult to understand. But the other challenge is we already have humans. Why are we trying to replicate our strengths? Why not actually focus on the weaknesses that and have, you know, why not develop tools that inherently are just complementing us rather than trying to automate and replace us? So that's the other thing that I find problematic about this quest, is that actually we could have powerful computational tools that are augmenting humans, but with the particular pursuit of trying to recreate human intelligence, that's not an augmenting, it's not being designed to augment, it's actually being designed to automate.
But if you listen to, you know, interviews of Sam Altman and other leaders within the industry, their sort of motivation is aimed to actually what you're just described, to augment, to help humanity to become better. So where is the conflict?
That's not actually what they're trying to do. Yeah, I mean, if you listen to what they say to VCs and how they've actually successfully been able to convince VCs to invest, you know, OpenAI just raised $40 billion at a $300 billion valuation, the largest private venture investment round in the history of the tech industry. What they're saying to VCs is, we will be ultimately able to sell a technology that can do essentially what most humans could do for pay, and sell it to CEOs as a service so that they don't hire workers anymore. That's how we're going to recoup that value for you, that 40 billion that you put in. And OpenAI's definition of AGI also says that it's highly autonomous systems that outperform humans in most economically valuable work. That's why that's how they're justifying to VCs to invest that amount of money in. It is a labor automating, not a labor augmenting technology. And we are now seeing many tech CEOs explicitly say that they are entering an AI era with an AI strategy where they're going to downsize their workforce. So once again, they're not retaining their workforce, but then increasing their productivity. They're maintaining the same amount of productivity and just doing it with a smaller staff now. So it is ultimately about automating, not augmenting.
But what was wrong with this approach? Just walk me through sort of your understanding that. What will be the downside of this approach?
Well, ultimately, why do we build technology or advanced technology? It's to help people live more dignified lives. And automating away people's work on a practical level just means that they don't get paid anymore. And there are many people that are now suffering around the world from a lack of economic opportunity and a lack of an ability to actually put food on the table for their kids. And I document some of those stories in the book. But also, then where do you get meaning? You know, now that you don't have anything to do, like, what are we transitioning to? And ultimately, I don't think that is enabling people to live in more dignified ways. Is actually just degrading their lives. And that, to me, is inherently antithetical to why we build technology in the first place.
I remember the story of these Kenyan outsourced workers. And I think there was the moment where you described the brother who was a writer and who lost the job.
Mm-hmm.
to ChatGPT, which essentially his brother was helping to train.
Yeah.
But if you, again, the counter arguments of Silicon Valley sort of leaders within this AI industry, that AI would essentially create much more jobs, and thus it will help humanity to go forward. What's your thought on this point?
Who said that? Because recently Dario Amodei literally said the opposite. So I'm curious who's saying that.
Well, I think it's just in general, they see this, that is basically pretty common, that technology by in a short period of time and sort of near term, yes, people losing jobs, but then essentially creates more jobs. Say the argument of they were horse drivers back in beginning of the century, and then the cars came and the horse drivers lost their jobs. But essentially now we have much more drivers having a job of driving cars.
Yeah, so one of the things that people never say when they make this argument is which jobs are lost and which jobs are created. And in previous waves of automation, with the automation of manufacturing, blue collar work, there was a pattern that is now beginning to play out with the AI wave of automation, which is you lose entry level jobs and you create lower level jobs than entry and higher level. But the career ladder breaks. So anyone that entered the industry before that entry level was automated away, they can access the higher level jobs. But the next generation that's graduating from college, university, graduate degrees, they end up not actually succeeding in the industry because they don't have the opportunity to learn and train and step on that first rung to go up. So they end up in even lower skilled jobs than before. And that is what we're seeing now with the wave of automation happening with AI. We're already seeing economic indicators of graduates from universities facing a job crisis. They are not able to find entry-level jobs as much as they used to. And now it's not blue-collar work, it's white-collar work. So it's finance, it's law that are being affected. And ultimately, if that continues to play out, we'll basically see the same thing that we saw with manufacturing, is that there will be more and more of a chasm between the older generations continuing to elevate themselves and the younger generations continuing to be stuck.
And that reminds me of another part of the book where you discuss the affective altruism, right? So essentially, going through the suffering for the benefit of a future sort of a mass profound returns for humanity. It's interesting. We're in Hong Kong, where Sam Bankman-Fried started in the early days of FTX before he moved to Bahamas, and we all know how it finished. So I understand now this sort of ideology is no longer a fashion or trend, but if you believe there is still the sort of the attitude, the approach, it still remains the same.
Yeah, and interestingly, I think that it's actually starting to regain fashion. Yeah, so effective altruism, I guess, as connected to SBF, is that he always said that he started FTX because of the EA ideology, and one of the mottos of EA that started to develop over time was this idea of earn to give. If you spend most of your effort just getting really, really, really rich and then donate everything to philanthropy, that is going to be morally better than actually working in philanthropy from the very beginning. And so that is what his whole origin story was. Like, instead of going into charity work, nonprofit work, let me focus on crypto and using that as a way to accumulate a rapid amount of wealth. And ultimately, of course, then he ended up in the place that he ended up on the back of that ideology. But the same ideology has become really, really popular in the AI world. And it's basically an extremely utilitarian, and it's utilitarianism to its extreme, where you try to imagine all of the possible value that could be created over millennia of time in the future compared to the value of present day. And obviously, the millennia of value is going to always outweigh the present. And so it is a very Silicon Valley-esque ideology in that it emphasizes, I mean, going back to the homelessness thing, like it emphasizes thinking about the future instead of your actual present. And because of that philosophy, it really ended up spreading quite intensely within the AI world, because the AI world runs on these ideas of ultimately we want to recreate something that could bring us enormous value in the future, but might have some unfortunate effects today. And right now it has been for the past 5 years, I want to say, really been driving a lot of the decisions of the companies, OpenAI, Anthropic, a little bit of Google and things like that, in that they, OpenAI, Anthropic in particular, like they really do over-index on theoretical futures rather than observing how the technology is impacting people right now and trying to fix problems with the things that might be happening right now.
Back to what we just discussed about the jobs and how serious this problem in what if there is any estimations or that you could share, or any sort of idea of how this may impact or impacting us as a society already?
The estimates that exist are not very good, because it's difficult to, so ultimately it's not AI that's taking people's jobs. It's executives that decide to lay off workers after they see what AI can do. And so there's always going to be a disconnect between what AI can actually automate in terms of its technical capability versus what executives then decide to try to automate when they see potential for the tool to do so. And we saw recently a case where Klarna, the CEO of Klarna, laid off a bunch of workers saying that we are entering the AI era, we want to replace all of these functions with AI. And then he had to rehire them back because it turned out that AI couldn't actually do that. But you could imagine that there are plenty of executives that will lay off the workforce, realize that AI is not as good, but it's good enough anyway, and they're just going to continue using things. So I think it's hard to predict what the impact will be, because there's a lot of human behavior elements to how the impact will play out. And hopefully, like, I hope that executives will also realize that even if they gain cost efficiencies in the short term, that actually in the long term, to build a more sustainable business, they should actually be ignoring the short-term cost efficiency gains and continue hiring those entry-level people so that they have a workforce to promote later down the line that actually was trained and ready to rise to the more senior level positions. But we are, like, there was a recent article in The Atlantic written by one of my colleagues there about the fact that the current economic indicator around, I forget what it's called, but it's basically how valuable is a college degree, like how much better employed are college graduates versus people that don't get college degrees. And the gap is really closing in that college degrees are no longer helping people in the job market, which could possibly be explained by the fact that those white collar entry level jobs that you would usually access with a college degree are being automated. So that is impact that we are literally already seeing playing out right now.
But if we draw the parallel with the, say, Industrial Revolution back in the beginning of the century, why is it different today? So the impact of Industrial Revolution, eventually, there was sort of short-term impact, or short-term, mid-term, maybe essentially caused things like First World War, but essentially helped the humanity to progress.
I mean, I think it goes back to who ultimately suffers in the short term, and it's always the same people who suffer. And one of the other things is, like, we actually don't. So most technology revolutions in history, like, I think there's a tendency for technologists to look at historical examples and say, like, every technology revolution, there's been some worker loss and some people suffering, but then we gain in the long term. But also every technology revolution has happened before we had human rights. So I don't actually think those historical examples are ones that we should emulate. Like, in a 21st century technology revolution, we should be aspiring to do better than we did in the past. And the problem is, it's the same people that suffer every single time. It's the working class, it's the marginalized, it's women, women, it's children, it's people in the global south. And they actually, many of them haven't recovered from the Industrial Revolution. There are a lot of environmental harms that came out of the Industrial Revolution that are still plaguing the communities that suffered from those environmental harms. Those communities still have suppressed economic opportunities and have not been able to continue progressing as the way that other developed communities have been. So I think it is a bit of a false example that ultimately the Industrial Revolution left everyone better off. It actually didn't. It's led to dramatically increasing inequality that has continued to be a legacy that we're grappling with today.
And you mentioned that the thing that you stumbled upon when you were investigating OpenAI is the level of secrecy, which was obviously opposite to its own name and the mission that they were communicating to the outside world. How would you explain this secrecy? What is this sort of a secret that they're trying to hide so much?
At the time when I was visiting the office, they were beginning to work on GPT-3, which was the generation of the model predating ChatGPT. And the reason why they were so secretive is because there was a faction of people at the company that genuinely believed this would be AGI. And they thought a really big part of OpenAI's founding mythology is this idea that they are the good guys, and they need to get to this technology first before the bad guys get to this technology. And so they had this level of secrecy because they thought, if this is going to be AGI, we can't let any bad guys in the world know that we have AGI. And that has carried over to present day, and that the executives still say a lot of the time that, like, they still onboard employees by saying, you are not joining a company, you're joining the modern day equivalent of the Manhattan Project. And you need to hold yourself to a different level of secrecy standard than working for any other tech company. And they still try to say that it's ultimately about, because so that when we get AGI, we can't let other people know that we have AGI, because then the bad guys might get it first. But it is also just a really great rhetorical way to retain control of information and try and prevent.
Essentially justification for being intransparent.
Yeah.
And have no no control from outside of what's actually is going on.
Yeah, it's justification to not have participatory, more broad public participation in AI development.
You spent a lot of time in the book describing what was actually happening during the so-called the coup, when Sam Altman was ousted by its board and then quickly reinstated over the course of a few days. But as I understand, it's still a mystery. Remains what actually happened there, because we haven't never heard any details from Sutskever or anyone participated in that. Do you have any sort of idea or sort of, I mean, if it's maybe speculative, but what actually really happened back then in this boardroom?
My book goes into quite a lot of detail on the conversations that happened that led the board to decide to fire Altman. And it really came down to two different forces that were playing out. One was that within the history of OpenAI, there's always been an ideological clash between two different divisions within the company. One division that believes that we need to build AGI as fast as possible because it's going to bring us to utopia. And the other one that believes AGI is going to kill everyone. And both of these factions have coexisted in OpenAI for a long time, because when it first started as an organization, AGI was not seen as a cool thing to work on. It was very much seen as a pseudoscientific thing that if you even associate with that term, you are seen as foolish and unscientific. And so there were only so many people that believed that they should be working on AGI, and they self-selected into the organization, and they essentially prescribed to either being a boomer the utopic vision, or a doomer, like this devastating vision. And there was, at the time when ChatGPT came out, there was essentially a polarization that happened in the company between these two different divisions, because ChatGPT was, to each faction, the perfect illustration of why they had always been right. So to boomers, seeing everyone using ChatGPT around the world and doing amazing things with the technology, they were like, see, we are going to get to utopia the faster we get this technology out. And to doomers, who were seeing everyone using ChatGPT and all the abuses that were coming out of that, they were like, see, we should have been cautious, and we should have been not actually releasing this technology and maintaining control of it. And so ultimately, the company ended up, there was a lot of chaos that was happening at the company, in addition to the ideological clash, because they were trying to scale their servers and the support to their users faster than any company had ever in the history of Silicon Valley. Like, they were the fastest growing consumer app ever. And that meant that they needed to try and keep their servers online. They needed to scale their employees, their teams, everything. And then there was this ideological clash happening. And the board was a bit more doomer leaning at the time, while the company was quickly moving into a much more boomer leaning phase. And in addition to that, so the board was already a little bit concerned about what was going on, and all these reports that they were hearing from employees about just general chaos, and also the seeming recklessness that the company was engaging in. And at the same time, there was a lot of feedback about Altman in particular, and whether or not he was capable of leading a company of such high importance. And one of the criticisms that has followed Altman throughout his career is that he has a loose relationship with the truth, and he is someone who will tell different people different things based on what they want to hear, not necessarily based on the ground truth of a situation.
You mean lying?
Loose relationship with the truth.
Okay.
Some people, his biggest critics say that he's a liar and manipulator. His greatest defenders say that he is just incredibly good at personalizing his message to people and persuading them to do things that ultimately no one else would be able to persuade them to do. So that's why I use that specific language. Is like, it's sort of in the eye of the beholder. Like, who you talk to, they will frame it in a totally different way, whether he's lying or whether he's doing something profoundly transformative. But the problem was, he lost a significant amount of trust among his most senior executives, as well as the board, simultaneously, because each of them were experiencing different challenges with him not being forthcoming about certain situations. But basically what happened was that Altman lost the trust of his two most senior executives and three members of the board. That was Ilya Sutskever, chief scientist, Mira Murati, chief technology officer, Helen Toner, Adam D'Angelo, and Tasha McCauley, the three independent board directors. And they each lost trust with Altman due to different reasons. But each of them had experiences where they felt like he had either manipulated them or intentionally not been forthcoming about certain details. And they had each made discoveries of that lack of forthcomingness by accident. And essentially, the two senior executives then approach the board and say, we do not trust Sam Altman to lead us to AGI. The board, being more doomer leaning and believing that if AGI falls into the wrong hands, it could be very devastating. That was an incredibly serious allegation that they needed to take seriously. So then they had a series of meetings where they intensely discussed whether or not it actually made sense for Altman to stay as the leader of the company. And by the end of those deliberations, they concluded that it did not. And that is what ultimately led them to fire him.
And yet he managed to come back.
So one of the things that Altman is very good at doing, he is a once-in-a-generation fundraising talent, and he is quite good at establishing relationships where he is the linchpin for the other person to receive financial reward. So not only was he the linchpin in the relationship with Microsoft and OpenAI, where Microsoft was the largest backer of OpenAI, was getting exclusive license of OpenAI's technologies, which was then enabling Microsoft's business to do quite well. And Altman was a conduit to that. He was also a conduit for employees because during the time that the board fired Altman, there was actually a tender offer that was making its way to finalizing that would have allowed some employees to cash out millions of dollars. And without Altman there, it was very likely that the tender offer would have dissipated and many of these employees would have not gotten their cash outs. Some of them had already put down payments on houses based on the idea that they would have gotten those cash outs. So there was a high level of financial fragility there as well. And then the investors who had put money into the company were also getting cold feet. The idea that if Altman wasn't going to be there, they didn't want to continue putting their investments into the startup. And so there was a lot of money on the table that was suddenly going to disappear without him.
So the financial fragility, you feel like it was the main motivation for most of the staff to sort of vote for Altman to come back, or?
It depends. There were a lot of intersecting motivations, but it was one of the dominant ones. Of course, there were also plenty of employees that thought that he was just a really great leader, but money was a major factor. And not just the tender offer, but also many people felt that because they think that AGI is going to be an extremely capital intensive technology to build, that Altman is the only person with the fundraising abilities to continue to lead the company, not just for the tender offer, but in the next 5-10 years. And so there was a lot, like money was like a very, very critical part of why many of the employees ultimately rallied to try and pressure the board, and investors rallied to pressure the board, and Microsoft rallied to pressure the board to ultimately bring Altman back.
Since we're talking about Altman, you decided to include rather serious allegations coming from his sister.
Yeah.
Could you explain why you decided to do that, and why do you think it's necessary to cover this part in your book?
Yeah, so Altman has 3 siblings. He's the oldest of 4. He has 2 brothers right below him, and then a younger sister who's 9 years younger than him. And the brothers followed his career in that they all went into the tech industry and became investors. And the youngest sister was always sort of the black sheep of the family. She wanted to be an artist, a comedian, a writer, and she was never that interested in going into tech. She is now estranged from the family, and she's given a series of allegations, the worst of which she said that Sam sexually abused her as a child, and she filed a lawsuit in court alleging this abuse. And part of the reason why I included it is because she filed a lawsuit, and it is important to acknowledge that that is one of the things that is now greatly pressuring Sam Altman in his behavior in the world as an executive. And it is clearly also pressuring the company in that when I ended up, OpenAI didn't participate in my book. I tried extensively to get their perspective. And part of the process was I sent them 40 pages of comment requests with detailed findings in my reporting and asking them if they would like to respond so that I could include their perspective in the book. They didn't do that, and they wouldn't meet with me except for the one case, which is when they found out that I had interviewed the sister. And so it has become a company issue. It has risen to the level where it factors into the decisions of other executives at the company. And so it was an important dimension of what is leading. It's one of many factors now that actually shapes how Sam acts as a CEO and how the company acts in the world. The other thing that's interesting about Annie in particular is that, like I say in the book, that we can't actually know whether or not her allegations are true, because she's talking about something that would have happened over 20 years ago. And ultimately, as a journalist, I can't make a conclusion about whether it's true or not. I wasn't there. I haven't seen any evidence. But she did make other allegations that she did have documentation for. And specifically, she alleges that her family withheld significant financial support from her when she really needed it while she was facing severe physical health and mental health problems. And she provided her physical health records, her mental health records, as well as exchanges and correspondence with her family showing that she did request financial assistance and there was none provided. And that ultimately led her to experience housing insecurity, food insecurity, and to turn to sex work for being able to pay for her rent and her food. And the thing that also struck me about her story is that she is more representative of the average person in the world than Sam Altman is. And so her experience of AI should be more illustrative than what Sam Altman might tell us the average person, how the average person will experience AI. And as a sex worker and as someone who's economically vulnerable and has a lot of health challenges, she actually, primarily her experience with AI was that her financial opportunities were constrained because she found that after she engaged in sex work, she was not able to access a lot of opportunities online anymore. And when I was speaking with experts about why that might have been, they pointed out that many online platforms, they will try to constrain the footprint of a sex worker, even in accounts that are completely unrelated to their sex work, because they've already been flagged by AI algorithms as a problem. And so she was unable to gain traction on her YouTube, on her Etsy. She was trying a podcast. She wasn't gaining traction in that way as well. And all of the things that Altman and other OpenAI executives promise us, AI is going to alleviate poverty, AI is going to give everyone affordable healthcare, AI is going to solve the food crisis. All of these things were not things that she experienced, but she did, in fact, experience the thing that many other people are now experiencing now, which is constraining of economic opportunity.
Yeah, if we put aside Sam Altman and OpenAI, there are other companies such as Anthropic, which actually presented itself as the one that cares about the safety, cares about transparency. But as I understand, you have a very different perception of Anthropic as well. Can you walk us through what's wrong with this approach that they declare?
Yeah, so this goes back to the ideological clash that has long existed within OpenAI and the AI industry, which is between the boomers and doomers. And whereas the Anthropic often is more rooted in the doomer ideology, Dario Amodei himself is very much in that doomer mind frame where he believes that AGI could potentially lead to devastating effects unless it's developed extremely cautiously, and then it could lead to profoundly positive effects. And whereas the boomers and doomers themselves consider them to be arch nemesis of one another, I consider them to be two sides of the same coin, in that each of them believes that AGI is possible and is right around the corner, which is that is not rooted in any scientific consensus. In fact, 75% of longstanding AI researchers, according to a recent survey, do not think that we even have the techniques available yet to recreate human intelligence, or do they know if it's ultimately even going to be possible. But both boomers and doomers believe that it's going to happen, it's imminent, and both conclude that they alone should be allowed to control and develop this technology. And so what I see is Anthropic's just doing the same thing as OpenAI. They might position themselves as the better of the two, but when you actually look at the track record of each company, they're doing exactly the same thing. And it's just a matter of branding, whether you think one is different from the other. They're both scaling labs. They're both developing large-scale generative AI models. They're both trying to pursue AGI. And the scaling aspect of what they're trying to do and the speed at which they're trying to do it is what I argue in the book has led to a lot of vast consequences all around the world when it comes to labor exploitation, data privacy infringement, copyright infringement, and ultimately environmental and public health harms.
But what exactly wrong with the LLMs? Oh, what's it's the scale that
It's a scale.
it's the speed, it's the lack of safety controls, it's just a sort of reckless pursuit to, you know, be commercially successful despite all the downside of and on the way.
First and foremost, to me, it's the scale. And the reason the scale is in and of itself problematic is because when you need to scale these technologies to the degree that these companies have done so, where you're scraping the entire English language internet to train these models, you automatically run into a bunch of data privacy challenges, copyright challenges, and you are using data sets that are inherently difficult to understand because they are at a scale where these companies are not manually combing through the data sets to understand what's actually in them and what they're feeding into their models. So you end up with very polluted data sets that are going into models that not only leads to then model behaviors that are difficult to understand and control, but also to labor exploitation. So that goes back to the Kenyan worker that I interviewed, Mofat Okinye, whose brother had his writing job automated away by ChatGPT. But Mofat himself, he was part of a team of workers in Kenya that were contracted to perform content moderation on the effects of what happens when you train a model on polluted data sets. It starts to spew a lot of hateful, toxic, racist, abusive things. And Mofat was on the sexual content team for OpenAI, where he was trying to develop the mechanisms that he was annotating the data that would allow OpenAI to develop the mechanisms by which to block this sexual content from reaching its users. And what that meant for Mofat was that he was reading the worst possible sexual content on the internet day in and day out, as well as AI generated content that was where OpenAI was prompting its models to imagine the worst possible sexual content on the internet. And that profoundly broke down his psychology. It left him a shell of a person that he was before. And ultimately, his wife left him because she could not understand why he was undergoing that transformation. And he didn't know how to explain that his job involved reading sex content all the day. So it broke down his family. It broke down his community and the people that depended on him. And that labor exploitation is only a result of using polluted data sets at scale. And then you have the environmental harms of the scaling paradigm, where you need an extraordinary amount of computational infrastructure to support the training and deployment of these models. And that is leading to an unprecedented rate of build out of data centers and supercomputers around the world. And there was recently a McKinsey report that projected that based on the current pace of build out, we will need to add 2 to 6 times the amount of energy consumed annually by the state of California. We will need to add that much onto the global grid in the next 5 years. And most of that will be serviced by fossil fuels. So there was actually just a UN report that came out a few days ago that said that AI data centers are single-handedly leading to a major reversal in climate progress globally, because the tech giants have seen an uptick of 150% in their carbon emissions just from building out these data centers for AI development and deployment. So we're accelerating the climate crisis. There's also, of course, air pollution that happens when you end up having coal plants and methane gas turbines that are powering these data centers. And we've already seen a lot of reports of communities being affected by that. And you end up with a fresh water crisis because these data centers need to be cooled with fresh water. They cannot be cooled with other types of water because it leads to bacterial growth. It leads to the equipment being corroded over time. And so there are literally communities around the world right now that are competing with data centers for access to freshwater resources. And I write about one of those communities in Montevideo, Uruguay, where they were experiencing a historic level of drought. And the Montevideo government was mixing toxic water into the public drinking water supply just to have something come out of the taps when people were opening them. And people who were too poor to buy bottled water were drinking that toxic water, which meant women were having higher rates of miscarriages. The elderly were having inflamed chronic illnesses. And it was in the middle of that Google decided to build a data center in that community that proposed to use their fresh drinking water. And Bloomberg recently came out with a story that said that 2/3 of these data centers are actually entering these water scarce areas. So all of all of that is rooted in scale. And the problem is, or maybe the solution is, we don't actually need scale for AI progress. This is like, people sometimes believe that scaling is the only way to get AI advancements, but it's actually not. It is an extremely inefficient way to get AI advancements. And as we saw, for example, earlier this year with the Chinese model DeepSeek, there's actually, like, you can use extraordinarily less amounts of computational infrastructure to get the same capabilities. And so the answer, the question then is, why haven't we done that?
Since you mentioned in DeepSeek, I wonder, there's sort of a paradox where Silicon Valley companies essentially prohibiting Chinese citizens to get any access to their products, while there is no such sort of limitations coming the way back from Chinese models. How do you explain that?
Like, how do I explain what the U.S. government is thinking and what these companies are thinking? I mean, my speculation is that these companies are trying to block Chinese citizens from having access to their models as a way to posture with the US government about being American companies that are trying to fortify American dominance in technology, and therefore they're not going to actively benefit China. Like, that's my speculation. I don't actually know why.
But isn't
why they do that?
There's a conflict within this if we are aiming to develop this progress, achieving AGIs to the benefit of the humanity, right? Not the benefit of the US government or US itself.
Yes.
If there are different ways to get access to these products, you can use VPN, and it's pretty common in China to have access to all the Western technologies through VPN. I mean, it's naive to think that you just block users and they won't have access. So that's what makes you think it's a posture. It's just
exactly. That's what makes me think it's posturing. They know very well that this is not a real block. I mean, I don't know if you read Careless People, the book that came out about Facebook recently. But in that, this is a book that was written by a former Facebook executive sharing internal details that had never been previously reported about conversations that she had as a Facebook executive. And one of the things that they revealed is that Facebook never left China. They full well knew that, there are plenty of Chinese users that are still using Facebook, using VPN, and they were actively cultivating that usage. But in the eyes of the US government, they were blocked.
So essentially, it also leads us to this aspect of sort of a power play between the countries and governments. And do you feel like this pursuit of AGI is just not scaling, this aggressive, brutal scaling of the LLMs and overall speed of and pace of development of this industry is dictated by the desire of the governments and beyond just the commercial goals and motivations?
I see. So the reason the title of my book is called Empire of AI is because I make this argument that OpenAI is a corporate empire. And when I say that, I don't just mean like it's a large company. I literally mean, in the historical sense, the way that the British East India Company was a corporate empire. And I don't use that literal analogy in the book, but it has become increasingly relevant in the way that the US government is trying to how OpenAI and the US government have been interacting under the Trump administration, because the British East India Company as a corporate empire was also supported and abetted by a nation state empire, the British Crown. And ultimately, the British Crown at the time was eager to and willing to allow the East India Company to strike economic agreements, gain political leverage, and ultimately wage war, levy taxes, do all these things in other parts of the world and colonize the other parts of the world as a company, because their thought was that eventually the nation state can nationalize the company, which is what they did. And then all of those corporate assets will become nation state assets. And officially, the colonization of India first happened at the behest of the East India Company. And then when the company was nationalized, India officially became a colony of the crown. And so I think
there's a hidden agenda, more like a strategic. You see, like,
I don't think it's hidden at all. I think this is a really, really important historical analogy for understanding how OpenAI and the Trump administration are each operating. OpenAI definitely is trying to build its own empire, but it is trying to use the US government. It's trying to position itself as an American company to avoid regulation, because the US government is ultimately the only government really that can regulate OpenAI and place checks on OpenAI. And so they play this game of, we're American, we're ultimately helping to fortify the nation. And the US government also really likes that. They want these corporate empires to do the bidding of the US empire. You know, the Trump administration has been very transparent about the fact that they want to rebuild the American empire, and they want to seize land from other countries to do that. And so what better way than to have these corporate empires be very successful multinationals that also are taking land and building data centers and installing American and hardware and software all around the world, that one day, like, whatever the modern equivalent of nationalizing this company is, like, that is sort of what I see as the hope of the Trump administration or the US government in general, is like, help these companies be as successful as possible, have as much global reach as possible, so that eventually we can turn all of that into just American assets. And but I think that the company is also, their end game is not necessarily to just become nationalized and have all their assets turned into nation state assets. They're also playing a game where they just want to be the empire. And if they can continue just building out the empire to the point where they become large enough to supersede the US government, then they're the ones that are dominating and ruling everything.
I understand you raised a lot of alarms and within the book, describing this a lot of controversy surrounded this industry, and inevitably while reading the book. So, what's the call to action? What's your vision of how things should be? What we can do about this all?
Yeah. One of the things that I really, really want to see is people start shifting the trajectory of AI development in a different direction. Stop thinking about the scaling paradigm and actually start thinking about real innovation in AI. And what I mean by that is, before OpenAI started focusing on the scaling paradigm, there were plenty of researchers in the field and entrepreneurs within the tech industry that were actually going the opposite direction. They were thinking about tiny AI. How can you build AI, really powerful AI models with extremely small amounts of data and extremely small amounts of computation? And that was really exciting, innovative research and technology building that just then dissipated. There's someone recently pointed out to me that when you look at the distribution of capital that has been invested into startups, 90% of it, or some like really, really high number, is actually just locked up in OpenAI and Anthropic now. And so that is a level of, it's just huge opportunity cost where we do not have money going into other really innovative methods that are imagining fundamentally different AI technologies that are not so costly on this basis of scale. And I really hope that, researchers that are listening to this, entrepreneurs that are listening to this, investors that are listening to this, that's actually a huge market opportunity. Instead of all investors glomming on and all startups glomming onto a single approach that is overly saturated and not actually leading to that much, there's not a level of healthy competition in that area. Actually just shift away, start focusing on the types of AI technologies we actually need, task specific AI models that tackle challenges that we actually need solved, that are inherently lend themselves to the strengths of computation. Things like drug discovery, materials discovery for better energy storage solutions, more integration of renewable energy into the grid resilience, better healthcare applications where we have AI detecting cancer earlier in MRI scans or Alzheimer's earlier in MRI scans. These are technologies that have existed for a long time, but they haven't been commercialized at scale. And if we did have a way to develop and deploy them and commercialize them at scale, I think that would bring real broad-based benefits of AI to everyone.
And what would be your message to those listening, watching? They're basically having their careers. They run maybe companies, small businesses, or they work in the corporates. What they all can do about this? I mean, they're also under pressure of the competition. There is an inevitable risk of losing their business if they won't invest into AI. So how they would solve this puzzle? But they genuinely want to be good. They don't want to be evil. They don't want to do harm. But they're put into the situation where they're in between.
I think spend time learning about what the technology actually can and can't do, because then it becomes really obvious that the bubble's going to pop. And then, like the current LLM bubble is going to pop.
What do you mean by a bubble going to pop?
The amount of investment that has gone into this particular approach is predicated on the idea that it's going to produce equivalent benefits that will pay back all those investors, the $40 billion that have been invested. And when you actually understand the technical capabilities of these models, you realize that they're not going to do that. Where are you going to get back the $40 billion? These models are not, they can only be used in a narrow set of cases. And we've already seen, there are plenty of headlines now of people trying to use them in cases where they're not actually, they're just not well suited. And, we've seen lawyers have scandals where they try to use these LLMs for legal assistant research, and it ultimately results in them filing cases in court that are completely hallucinated with bogus citations. So ultimately, as more and more of those examples come out of the LLMs failing in ways that they aren't supposed to be deployed, the set of deployments for these technologies is going to start to narrow. And once you realize how narrow it is going to be, then you realize that it's not going to bring back that 40 billion or however much more money is going to be pumped into it's just not even 40 billion. That's just the amount that OpenAI raised for its latest funding round. But the Stargate project that OpenAI also announced with the Trump administration is $500 billion of investment into the computational infrastructure for training these next generation LLM technologies. So I would say, educate yourself on what can these models actually do? And then it'll be abundantly clear that LLMs are not everything that they're chalked up to be, and you should not actually be spending that much time investing in it or putting all your eggs in that basket. And it will also become more clear where you should be investing in AI, the more task-specific AI models that are focused on, sectoral applications or particular well-scoped challenges. And that, in fact, will make you more competitive.
Do you have any examples of sort of ethical AIs or something that you would prefer over OpenAI or Anthropic or other big models?
Yeah, all of the applications that I just mentioned, I think would be ethical AI, using models that help facilitate.
Any specific names that you could refer to? Or?
So AlphaFold was a AI model, task-specific AI model that DeepMind developed before it started on the LLM path and shifted away from the AlphaFold research. It was a task-specific AI model that was designed to predict with extreme accuracy how a protein will fold once you feed in the amino acid structure sequence. And that helps facilitate a better understanding of disease and helps with drug discovery. And it won the Nobel Prize for chemistry in 2024. So that is something, it was not built on language technology. You know, it had nothing to do with LLMs or ChatGPT or anything like that. It wasn't trained on polluted data sets. It was actually trained on extremely pristine data sets. That's the reason why it's so highly accurate and able to do that prediction. It was tackling a problem that inherently the computational strengths of AI are good for and is different from what humans are good for. You know, humans would never be able to do that. And that is why it's a perfect case for AI. It is a highly computational problem that needs powerful computation to do. And ultimately, the downstream effects of this technology are going to be really beneficial. So it neither has the harms of the development, and it also has many more benefits in deployment than LLMs.
What's your personal view on how things will develop going forward? You mentioned the bubble will pop. What's next? You're more pessimistic towards the next sort of decade of AI development, or you see there's a sort of light in the end of the tunnel?
I generally don't believe in predictions because I think predictions assume that the future is written. And part of the reason why I wrote this book is because I think the future's not written and everyone has a role in shaping the future. And I'm very optimistic that if people start taking seriously the fact that we've over-indexed on a particular approach that doesn't actually make financial, environmental, labor, or social sense, and start shifting resources towards other types of AI development, that we will end up in a much better place. So I hope that people will take up that mantle and figure out how they plug into that ecosystem.
Thank you, Karen. It was a pleasure to talking to you.
Thank you so much.